And now here's part 2 of our episode. I like when our guests have chosen a lesser known song, or like maybe a lesser less popular song for their standout, because it breaks the ep up a little bit.
And who does not love a Gladys Knight sample? That's all I have to say.
Gladys.
Well, I got a question before we dive into the perfection stuff, because that's usually what comes after a little intermission here. Can you say a little bit more about the skits? Because they are. I'm also curious to know, because now that everything is digitized and in Spotify, you can't separate the skits from the tracks. Like they're melded in with other songs. And I think about other artists who have done similar things on their albums. Like last season we talked about Janet Jackson, and most of Janet Jackson's albums feature some sort of transitional skit in between the songs, but they're separate tracks. On the original album, was it separated, or did it all blend together the way that it does on Spotify right now?
I'm pretty sure it was always like part of the track. Like I don't think they separated it on the track list at all. And yeah, actually I was reading last night. I guess I didn't really know this. I kind of thought Wu-Tang was sort of the inventor of the skit concept, but I was learning that it was actually De La Soul who was credited with like at least inventing the skits in the rap world on albums. And which Janet Jackson album was it that had skits?
You name it. I mean, it started with Rhythm Nation. But then she followed, and most of her albums since then have done that, although I think her most recent album doesn't. And sometimes they were like little excerpts of songs. Sometimes it's just her being silly in the studio. Sometimes it felt like it was pushing a narrative forward. It wasn't definitely not used the same way that Wu-Tang does on this album, where it feels like it's always this sort of conversation between them, or catching them in the middle of some sort of, incident or event. I think Janet's are much shorter and just kind of, pushing the album forward.
Oh, cool. All right. I honestly need to listen to more Janet Jackson. I'm an amateur when it comes to her catalog. But nevertheless, yeah, I mean, the way that they approach skits, you can tell, I think, that they're really trying to make it. It seems like they're really influenced by like movies that they've seen, or like they're really trying to. It seems like they're probably scripted, but most of them, it seems like, are really good at acting. Like if you listen to like the very first skit is on the 4th track of this album, where it's like the Kill the Tape skit. And so you can tell it must have been a little bit rehearsed from what it sounds like, but they're all pretty good at like kind of sounding like it's being ad-libbed. You can tell it's like a scene, sort of like a scene out of their life, and it introduces us also to a lot of the 5%er Nation of Islam like slang that they use all the time in their songs. So it offers like a good sort of intro to that, and sort of like another way to introduce people to their whole vibe and aesthetic, and like how sort of like goofy they were, but also how they, you could tell they were like after Quentin Tarantino's heart in a way, from the early days, where they were really trying to like make this into like a multimedia experience, and also a gritty crime drama sort of.
So let's talk about why this album's perfect then. Why not? Let's start with your criteria for perfection in the album. What were the first things that you thought of when we gave you that brief?
Yeah, so thinking about that question, obviously the overarching theme, I think I just go back to what I look for in music in general is music that's, you can tell, is just soulful and full of meaning for the artists themselves, that I think translates, or it's kind of imprinted onto the listener. Also, I'm a sucker for critical consensus, so I love I automatically am drawn to the albums that are widely acclaimed, if only so I can know like what I'm missing out on. Because like this album is one of those albums where it's like, if you hang out with people who are like the music critic type, or like the type to post on like Rap Genius, or or like Discogs or something. This is like, it's one of those albums that comes up a lot. And in any genre, I'm always interested in those albums that are like, considered just classics of their form. But then I think personal criteria for a perfect album, how I was approaching it when I was picking these albums for your podcast, I was thinking about how much I have just listened to it in general. And for 36 Chambers, I mean, I still know pretty much all the lyrics from memory. So definitely put in some hours on this one.
That's impressive. That's very impressive.
Yeah, like 12, 14 years later or something. I also was thinking about how many tracks are like skips or just tracks that are ones that you could miss if you had to. And I think on this album there's basically no skips.
No skips, yeah.
Which even, I mean, for me, honestly, is rare. Like there's usually at least one or two where I'm like, I don't need to listen to this right now.
I think I'm going to pause you right there because I've realized I've done a gross disservice. I haven't put any points on the board for you yet, but I think that's okay because I think I've been engrossed. I've been engrossed in your narrative, been engrossed in your knowledge base so far, and I'm excited to hear what these other criteria are going to be because no skips was a bold choice and controversial. So I'm going to put 36 Chambers on the board for you. For your work so far, and I'll do 36 Chambers, which is good, by the way, and 3 kilotapes.
Nice.
So you get those extra 3 kilotapes for my gross misconduct.
Is this inspired by On Cinema, where it's like 3 bags of popcorn and a soda or something?
Yeah, you could say that there's some influence taken there.
Are you saying in this case, Andrew, that is a factor for you, that it has to be an album that is you don't want to skip anything?
Not necessarily. I mean, it was something that I think about, like how many songs are skips, or even like not necessarily like how many of them are skips, but how many of them are ones that I like definitely always skip, or ones that I just, occasionally skip when I am just like not in the mood. Like I'm thinking of like for like Illmatic, the Nas album, there's only one song on there that is kind of a skip. It's One Time for Your Mind, because it's like kind of a slower one and like sort of meandering, and it's still like a really good song. And like if I was gonna put myself in the mood of like listening to the album front to back, like I would still probably listen to that one. But it's like that's like just the one weak spot in that album, or like
I think that's a take. I think people love that song.
I mean, I'm sure they do. Yeah, I mean, that whole album is just classic.
I just can't imagine listening to Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers. I can't imagine you press the shuffle button on this because it just feels like you can't. It feels like there is such a carefully laid out sequence that even if you are going to skip any tracks, you would still at least be listening to it chronologically.
Or another one I think of is like for In Rainbows, Radiohead album. Obviously, I agree with you, Tyler. That's a perfect album. But Faust Arp,
I was just going to say, that's a skip.
Yeah. So like that's perfect. I think that's another perfect example is that, I mean, again, completely flawless, like no room for extra changes album. But I mean, that one's like, I mean, it's also only like 2 minutes long. So, I mean, maybe they kind of knew it.
And not to go back too deep into In Rainbows, but the song that I hear people hate on the most for that album is Videotape, which I feel like they say that it would be a skip if it wasn't the last song on the album. You know what I mean?
If they say that, then they're not real Radiohead fans, and they should shut up.
It's been said. It had to be said. I'll give you a few more points for that.
Give him an ARP full of points.
I'll give him 2 ARPs full of points. Chock full of points.
Are there other standards that you were thinking of, Andrew, when in quest of perfection?
Yeah, I think a couple of other ones that I've thought of, maybe this is similar to the first one, just how personally invested I remember being in the album or artists, which in this case, again, was a lot because I still know all the words. How I consider it, I guess, how central it was or is to my identity growing up, which I think this album became pretty central to my identity as a music listener. And also when I started sharing it with my friends, we would always be quoting it and listening to it like in the car. So that became, a big part of my teenage experience. I wrote here how much I think it deserves perfect album status, which I don't really remember what I meant by that, but
is that like a zoom out question? Like you ask yourself in context, is it deserving?
yeah, I guess it's like, I think it means, okay, well now I'm now reading more of my notes here. I wrote, to me, perfect also means greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
Sort of similar to the Skip question. Not every song on this album, or I think not every song on albums that you would consider perfect, they don't all have to be perfect 10 songs on their own, but when you take it all together and when you also take the influence that it had on you or like the culture at large, I think that is a big part of what makes an album perfect.
Definitely. This idea of influence, I think, is really interesting too, because when you look at those same artists that were kind of coming up at the same time, and then we talked about Nas, we talked about Biggie, like it was very much, we haven't really talked about how this was an East Coast thing. This was like and for us living in the Midwest, I mean, we weren't on the West Coast or the East Coast. We didn't really have an allegiance in any way geographically. But like, what did that spark in your imagination? Like, was that something that was interesting to you about this music in context as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I think when I first started listening to it, I wasn't really super familiar with the East versus West drama beef that was going on at the time, like when this album was released, and ended up being like probably like the big story of hip hop history in the 90s, like the whole Biggie versus Tupac saga and like crazy conspiracy theories that still continue. But then when I started reading about this album, like immediately once I started listening to it, it is really awesome, like how it fits into that narrative of the East Coast kind of taking back the crown from the West, and sort of, and even you can still tell today, like just listening to Tupac, or like thinking of like Dre and like NWA's music that was coming out a few years before this one, and then this comes out, and it's like it is like a complete like 180 from those albums, and it's kind of incredible how much that resonated with people, maybe to an even greater extent than the like glitz and glamour of the West Coast sound at that time. Then you have this raw, like unfiltered sound that had no real parallel back then, and was it goes also from being aspirational in a way, like the West Coast, like Tupac sort of sound or lyrical content, was very much like, I'm rich and like I'm like having a good time like in my mansion, and like the weather in California is amazing, and then you go to Wu-Tang where it's like it's really cold and dark and everything sucks, and but also that makes us even cooler than you, kind of.
Yin and yang, man.
Yeah, and so like that whole part of it is really fascinating.
But that was something that you weren't even really aware of it at the time when you first listened to it, right? Because I mean, the album came out in '93, so this is an album that you're coming to years after it had been established. So I mean, is that just, I mean, could you hear that in it, like in your experience, or was it? I guess I'm still just sort of wondering, like, what the real personal draw is in this album for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess I probably really was not aware of it at the time, but I think I was really drawn to. I think I've always been drawn in like movies and TV to like kind of the sort of darker atmospheric stuff. I don't know. Yeah, I guess it's hard to really explain, but it's like really interested. Like I think when I was talking about like my first experience with rap, another part of the inappropriateness is like how it's like most rap songs stereotypically talk about like sex and like women all the time and stuff, and like they do that in Wu-Tang too, but it's kind of secondary compared to like sort of the West Coast sound. It's like it's not as like overtly sexual too, which like as a prudish teenager in the Midwest, that was also probably a big part of it for me, is that I felt like I could listen to it without feeling like a loser for not ever having a girlfriend. But if that makes any sense. But yeah, I don't know, I think that was part of it too, whereas like these guys aren't really bragging about like their life or like how popular they are or something. They're bragging about just how their rough upbringing like influenced their coming of age into this mindset that they are stronger and more resilient than most people. And I think that resonated with me a lot. And just like the atmospheric like darkness of everything, I think is also another thing that I love in just other music in general, like Radiohead or like Aphex Twin is another artist I like a lot, and I love when it's like I love those ambient sounds, like those samples that you can't really tell what it is, and so yeah, just the whole vibe of it is really awesome to me.
We could have a whole separate conversation. I think Tyler told me that at one point you were considering Aphex Twin with the ambient music volume 2 or something like that.
Yeah. We got to talk about that at some point.
We could have a whole because I've used so much of that music for sound design in the past. Like I mean, totally for school projects, not like professional productions or anything. Because licensing.
No, that would be illegal, Michael.
Oh my gosh.
we don't do illegal things.
No.
Not on this pod.
Yeah, we'll have to come back to that one. And that one is one I need to do even more research for, because I guess it's probably harder to talk about.
It would be a real tough listen for our listeners too, because most of the songs are like 11 minutes long and they're extremely ambient, and like many measures go by before something changes.
We can't talk about Janet Jackson every week. So
this is true.
Yeah. So there's a lot of music out there.
We're doing this for your own good, listener.
Yeah.
It's like eating your vegetables. You gotta eat your
vitamins.
You gotta eat your IDM.
Vegetables get a bad rap. I heartily enjoy vegetables. A good roasted Brussels sprout, delicious.
Yeah, if your gut can handle that, it's a lot of fiber there. You gotta be careful.
Oh yeah. Oh, I'm bring it on. Bring it on.
Bring on the fiber.
My limited knowledge of Wu-Tang, I sort of listened to, there was another podcast I listened to about 90s music that addressed this a little bit, and chose the song Cream as one of like the songs that defines the 90s or explains the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And there was some resistance, I think, within the group to when they would go to when they would perform live and look at a bunch of suburban white kids coming to their concerts. I guess I just wondered what both of you, since I know you both enjoyed this album, like how you see your if you were aware of that at the time when you were listening to it, if it was something that affected the way you listened to it, or if you just maybe don't even have anything to say about it.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, at the time when I first was listening to this, I felt I was extremely cool for listening to 90s hip hop as a white kid growing up in suburban St. Louis, because I didn't really know anyone else my age who really listened to this stuff. Felt really important for that. It was funny, like I think learning more about later on about how even like groups like NWA were really popular, almost like more popular among suburban white kids, like you said, than like what you would think would be their target demographic. And it is interesting how that happens. I think it's probably has a lot to do with just our whole media ecosystem. I think also when I was listening to this album and other Wu-Tang albums, maybe just me being a teenager, but I sort of a little bit saw myself in some of their lyrics and like their stories. Like it resonated with me a lot. Like not, I mean, obviously not like the hardship aspect of it, but the finding yourself aspect of a lot of their lyrics, where they talk about, you know, learning from your mistakes and growing as a person. And also the like braggadocio nature of their rhymes. I was like, oh yeah, like this is you know, this is how you can make yourself feel confident. It's like telling yourself that you're better than everyone else, and like sometimes it's all it takes to make yourself feel a little bit stronger. So yeah, in kind of a silly way, I think it resonated with me, even though it was so like far removed from my life. But also, I mean, it opened me up to a lot of other really interesting details about someone else's life, like all the Nation of Islam references. You know, that was like something that I would never be in touch with in my day-to-day life at all. But it's like that's a whole other, like, you know, just culture that is really prominent among Black people and among, you know, people who have like been incarcerated. Like that was like such a big part of it, I guess. Just but I guess also seeing that, like I said, where they're, you know, really going after like the Tarantino vibe. Like, you know, I was really into Tarantino and like Goodfellas and stuff back then too. Like just like they were, and like they enjoyed you know, getting together with their friends and hanging out and watching movies, like just like I did. So I was like, you know, ultimately we're cut from a similar cloth, and that's kind of, you know, what brings us all together ultimately, right?
I think it was a similar experience for me, where I think there was so many, it was so different from what I had been listening to before. Truly, Andrew introduced me to this. Andrew and our friend Connor. Shouts to Connor, as always. I think it was so different than anything I had ever heard, in language and in like the atmosphere that was created and the kind of story that was being told, that, you know, it just at that point in my life had not really been exposed to. And I think I was grateful for that, and I still am grateful for that. I think it's an indication of how powerful a piece of culture this album is. And, you know, a lot of the albums at that time. So not to show my cards that I kind of think you might be right, Andrew, that this album is perfect. I think if you think about impact, you know, and especially like cross-cultural impact, most people, even if they don't know hip hop, know the name Wu-Tang Clan. My mom probably knows who the Wu-Tang Clan is. And that's great. So I think obviously I'm at a stage in my life where I always want to be aware and like conscientious of the political implications of what, you know, media and art I am participating in and interfacing with. And so it's a thing that I was very grateful to have exposure to at that formative time in my life.
Yeah, me too.
Well said.
Well, if we had a comment section, I would welcome other people's experiences of that. As well, other people's. Maybe we'll have a comment section someday.
They can always. We put our email address on the
send us an email if you ever
description.
thought about that.
We haven't gotten any emails other than emails from the people who are going to be on the show, and from Asana, because I decided for a brief hot second that it might be a good idea to try and organize our process through project management software. Which, no offense to Asana, but that has not been very useful thus far. But whatever.
I guess Asana's not going to sponsor.
They're not going to sponsor us now. Oh.
Come on, buddy. Come on.
Missed your shot.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Well, I think that was well said, Andrew. And it was such the listening to this album again for this, in preparation for this pod, was really, it stirs up all kinds of nostalgia in me now for that time in our lives. And it was, you know, like just it being really cold out and driving around in your red Volvo. We wore that CD out, and because it was on a CD, we were always listening to these things. We had the little books of CDs in our respective vehicles.
Burned onto a CDR, like not the CD itself from the store, but like burned onto the disc and
your little case logic visor CD holder.
I never had one of those. Those were cool though. We had too many CDs for that though. We had to have more room.
Yeah.
Connor had a Star Wars one that's legendary. So let's go back over our board, shall we? I'll go over the points. The points that I gave you. I didn't give you many points, but I think the points that I gave you were powerful points. And then we'll give you an opportunity for a closing statement, and then we'll make our decision. Sound good?
Let's do it.
Okay. So for my 60-second recap, or 60-second introduction, 60-second glimpse into Wu-Tang Clan, you gave me an 11 out of 10. And I thank you for that. So that's what our board started with. And then when we finally did get around to giving you points for the whole breadth and odyssey you took us on with your experience with this and hip hop, to that point I gave you 36 chambers plus 3 kilotapes. Very gold star points there. And then we gave you also 2 ARPs full of points, so that we can always just have a little bit of a fast ARP acknowledgement in the pod. And that's where we stand. That's a pretty strong board. What would you say are your closing statements for why this album is perfect?
Well, I just, in the interest of not
rehashing,
being able to, say something that means anything instead of kind of rambling, which I've probably been doing a little bit.
It's that kind of pod.
There is just a quote that it's on a Wikipedia article for the album, but it's from Pitchfork, and I feel like it sums up it. Is in a retrospective review from like 2006 of the album. I think it sums up things pretty well. It says, "This is the sound of accidental fame. Something as unique and unusual as this record isn't supposed to find itself at the height of commercial viability. It's supposed to smolder underground, hidden from the view of mainstream America, who surely would not be ready for such a challenge. But America was ready, in part because this one challenged convention, not listeners." And then it goes on to say that their charisma is so undeniable that it propelled Wu-Tang Clan to the height of the rap game, and today stands not just as a hip-hop classic that introduced the concept of obscure thematic characters, but also bridged the gap between traditional old-school sensibilities and technical lyricism of today. And I think that is a good kind of wrap up of just why this album is still important and why people are still talking about it, and also why even in famously Martin Shkreli's trial for the jury selection, someone was recused from the jury because Martin Shkreli, as you may know, disrespected the Wu-Tang, and that is ultimately his biggest crime. So
I was wondering if he was going to come up. I was wondering if that final album was going to get mentioned.
What was the drug that he tried to take?
I don't even know. I feel like now he should just be known as the person who held on to Once Upon a Time in Shaolin. That is just
wherever you are, Martin Shkreli, you should be ashamed of yourself. Well, I think that was probably the strongest case you could have made in a wrap up. So Michael, Andrew's made his case. We see the points on the board. You've been here through this. What do you think is Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers by the Wu-Tang Clan a perfect album?
I think because of the personal connection, the way that you were drawn to it, and what it is like. I feel like it has appealed to you on like a mental and emotional level in so many ways. And it is a perfect album. It enters the pantheon.
It enters the pantheon.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you, Andrew. This has been a real treat. And I think that you are officially part of the This One Goes to 11 crew, and we're going to have to call upon your expertise when it's needed. We'll send up the signal.
You are now friend of the pod.
Friend official.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me. And let's do it again sometime.
Michael, what song are we going to play out on? What's our standout track from the play us out? What does that mean?
I don't even know.
What song are we playing out as our standout track from this album?
Our standout track is a little track called "Protect Your Neck." I think we chose it for a few reasons. The main one being that just about every single member of the group raps on this track. Also, strangely enough, it is the one track on the album on Spotify that does not have a little explicit mark next to it, and I think they actually do bleep out most of the profanity in it.
Yeah.
So, because I think it was the first single off the album, so I think that might have been on. I don't know if that was the case on the original album, but at least in this case, yeah, we're gonna close out with a little protect your neck for our listeners.
Awesome. Thanks for listening. Hit us in the email if you have any questions or people you want us to talk to, or just tell Andrew how good he is.
We'll pass on the message.
We'll pass that along.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.